I have been a lifelong campaigner. I have campaigned since I was 15, and the first campaign that I got involved in was trans rights and getting Ofsted to recognise a third gender. As we know, things have progressed slowly, so when I was 15, it was 1998. And so we're talking years and years ago. But only now are we seeing equalities for all genders or people who self identify their gender. It's very important because there's a psychological aspect to it as well as an equalities aspect to it. So you could say that I have been an equalities campaigner pretty much since I was in high school. I was on the school council as well, and that was my first instance of getting involved with something democratic and participating in trying to make things better for my school. And one of the things that we did as the school council was we influenced change within the school. One of the things that we changed was the school uniform to make them more comfortable. I didn't like the final design, but it was much more comfortable. But it was us coming together, finding consensus and saying, well, we need to change something and something for the better. And so something for the better was, well, it's going to be a lot more comfortable wearing these than those. That was our thinking as kids, right? Which leads me on to what I've done with my life since. Part of my drive is to empower people to speak up for themselves. I've trained over 2,000 young people in how to campaign, how to get involved in speaking up for their rights, how to get involved in influencing things at a small level or at a larger level, and ran my own program in civic participation. So this all fed into something called the citizenship curriculum, which used to exist, doesn't exist anymore. So young people that I've trained, for instance, in Camden, it was a small change. There were a group of young women in year 10, and they wanted to, well, they saw the problem. The problem was the school didn't have recycling bins at all. And so one of the ideas that they had was to install 2 bins. So one for landfill, one for recycling in every classroom. And so they attended one of the workshops that I ran. And from that workshop, they managed to influence the school and then turn that small action into something that Camden Council now implements across the whole education department. So that tiny change and that tiny thought that they had was the seed, and then what the training does, it kind of nurtures it. It says, how can you do it legally and how can you do it in a way that is non-violent? And the outcome of that, you can't measure it really. Well, you can, because the policy has changed. And when I talk about campaigning, when I talk about civic participation, is if you're not happy about something, well, speak up. You have the right to. We live in a very amazing and diverse country, and each of us have got our own stories, each of us have got our own likes, dislikes, and each of us have got within us the opportunity and the seeds for change, really. And that's those 2,000 young people, that seed has been nurtured. It has grown, it has blossomed. One of the students influenced changing the boiler of a school to something a bit more efficient. And it's not just about recycling. So after the 2011 riots, the themes that come out of the workshops changed. So before 2011, it was more towards recycling, environment, ethical consumption, much of the like. And after the riots, it was a market shift. In fact, it was a shift from environment to social policy, and it was about young people not having a voice for themselves. So these workshops that I was running, they were in the 10 most deprived boroughs, like Hackney, like Tower Hamlets, like Islington. And it started to turn from recycle more to respect us more. And one of the campaigns was Smile, it was called, one of the young people's campaign in a school. And it was about young people on a weekend campaign to smile at people in the street and get everyone to acknowledge each other, to break down the barriers that they'd started experiencing after the riots. So in a way, everything that happens both in and outside of school really affects that individual, and it goes back to the individual having a right, the individual having a voice. But when individuals come together, they can achieve so much more, because you can't achieve anything without support. And yeah, this is what those workshops did. It was vitally important. And then the money for that ran out, the grant ended for that, and here we are. Citizenship is not included in the core curriculum anymore, which is sad, because what that did was it showed the next generations of teachers, politicians, lawyers, cleaners, catering staff that their rights and their responsibilities as citizens. And now we don't have that, and we haven't had that for a very long time in schools. To me, that's very upsetting. And even more upsetting is that 16 to 18-year-olds were not given the right to determine their future with that Brexit vote. So for me, that kind of really hits a nerve, is because we aren't going to be the ones suffering. It's going to be the 16 to 18-year-olds suffering. I see it as suffering because they've not had their voices heard at all. Which brings us into the state of the UK at the moment and British values. Ever since Britain ended its imperial rule, we as a nation, I think, have found what it is to be British, apart from all of the horrible stuff that we did as colonial rulers. And we found our compassion. So after all of that violence, after slavery, after murder, after grabbing land, after all of that, we reached a point in our history where we finally said, you know what, being British isn't to rule, being British is to show compassion to the rest of the world. And partly because of all of the stuff that has happened in the past. And I think we are in a stage now where we've lost that compassion again, and everyone's out for themselves. If you remember, I was talking about individuals, and every individual has a voice, every individual has a right to express their voice. But if you don't come together, you can't achieve anything. You have to find consensus. You have to have your friends, you have to have your enemies as well, because friends and enemies, they both bring out the best in you, really. They both can argue with you in ways you can't argue with yourself. They can help you see perspectives that you once never saw. And that brings us back to empathy, that brings us back to compassion, that brings us back to being leaders through compassion rather than leaders through silencing dissent. And for me, if ever you read something, always question it now. Always say, is this the truth? Is this real? Is this based on evidence? And do I agree with it? And if you agree with it, great. If you don't agree with it, campaign.